The Ukrainian-Russian conflict remains unresolved, with intense confrontations occurring in pivotal regions. Every war has its strategic location that determine its trajectory. The regions of Zarnitsky, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia have been focal points since the inception of the conflict, particularly in Kherson, situated by the Dnipro River, and Bakhmut in the Donetsk region. There have been drawn-out skirmishes that have the potential to tip the war's balance. Bakhmut stands as a strategic linchpin, and its significance is not lost on either side. Reports suggest significant ammunition supplies from Russia and the capture of Wagner soldiers aiming to take over the area, particularly after a key Russian base was taken down in Melitopol due to strikes on Russian power plants. Efforts are in place to thwart these shipments. Recently, the Kherson region experienced heightened attacks from Russia, increasing tensions, though with limited casualties. The AIS team demonstrated resilience, repelling Russian advances, neutralizing numerous missiles, and initiating operations against Crimea. While we often delve into Ukrainian offensives, it's worth noting their defensive tactics as well. The narrative of how Ukrainian defenses have thwarted advances is indeed compelling. In a recent nocturnal assault on Ukraine's central and southern zones, the Ukrainian Air Force managed to down 30 out of 40 drones originating from Iran. Natalia Humenyuk, representing the Southern Command of the Ukrainian military, confirms ongoing Russian strikes on the Danube River's port structures. Reports from December indicate Moscow's intentions to cripple vital infrastructure, impacting the economy. Even with the brief Wagner Group descent in June, interactions between Russian President Vladimir Putin and ex-Wagner operative Andrei Troshev hint at Russia's continued reliance on mercenary forces. Troshev, who had roles in official security during the rebellion, is now entrusted by Putin to form new volunteer military units, as per sources from UK military intelligence. The Dnipro River region remains under Ukrainian military jurisdiction. Its strategic importance cannot be overstated, especially for the Ukrainian army's endeavors in Crimea. However, the Russian military has established multiple command hubs in the region, ensuring they maintain efficient control over their deployed troops. Command centers play a pivotal role in warfare. A recent Ukrainian artillery strike targeted one of these key facilities. Before delving into the details, I'd like to obtain your permission to discuss this operation's specifics. Reports indicate that the Ukrainian artillery had been monitoring this command center closely for some time. The 24th Division of the Russian Army, specifically the Motor Rifle Regiment, has been conducting regular training sessions here. Ukrainian intelligence and reconnaissance teams diligently observe the activities at this location, enabling them to anticipate the gatherings of Russian officers. On a date chosen for the strike, as the regiment officers convened, Ukrainian artillery was already in position. Their missiles inflicted significant damage, decimating the entire command facility. Subsequent to this strike, Ukrainian armored forces advanced, ensuring the command post's total destruction. Photographs from the aftermath reveal the extent of the damage. Reports suggest the strike resulted in the death of 8 Russian servicemen and injuries to 7 more. This unexpected offensive, particularly with its high-profile targets, shocked many, given the region's relative calm. Russian media will likely shed more light on the aftermath of this event in the Kherson area in the days to come. In the wake of the attacks, the Russian administrators in Sevastopol turned their attention to the city's shelters. Mikhail Rosvokab, the Kremlin-appointed official in occupied Sevastopol, conducted inspections of these shelters post the recent disruptions, indicating no immediate plans for restoration. He had initially initiated the construction of these shelters during a quieter period in the city. Addressing the facilities in these shelters, Ross emphasized that one shouldn't expect them to be fully equipped with amenities like seating or ventilation. Investments are being made for temporary shelter projects in Simferopol. As the frequency of attacks increased, staff from the occupation government's departments were reallocated to the Interior Ministry. Many other sectors under the occupiers' administration in the Ukrainian peninsula have followed suit. Reports indicate that a major portion of the occupation government in Simferopol has been relocated to a more secluded location. Furthermore, an overwhelming majority of the staff have been consistently absent from duty. It's suggested that many have vacated Crimea, taking their families along. The capture of Russian invaders highlights the efficacy of Russia's aerial defenses and their control over Crimea. The rhetoric of the occupying powers contradicts their claims of having complete control over the island's airspace. Does this mean the Ukrainian government will relentlessly pursue regaining control of the peninsula? Let's evaluate the current state of affairs and speculate on possible future developments. After consolidating their presence in Crimea in February, Russian troops advanced and managed to dominate much of southern Ukraine. Ukraine's top leadership understands that as long as Russia maintains its grip on Crimea, the nation's path forward remains contentious. Over the next few days, we'll assess if Ukraine's strategic moves for Crimea's full liberation influence the unfolding events. Kiev's determination to reclaim the annexed territory and its readiness to confront anticipated fresh Russian advances will be pivotal. Indeed, the situation in Crimea will significantly influence the course of the war. Among the many reasons to champion Crimea's independence is the fact that engaging Russian forces there could potentially cripple Russia's ability to further threaten Ukraine or its neighbors. Recent victories have solidified the notion that Ukraine is more than capable of reclaiming Crimea. While some in Crimea identify closely with Russia, a significant number cherish the autonomy that comes with independence. A deep dive into the region's history reveals that Crimea's rightful place is with Ukraine. The advancements made by Kiev, especially against Russian frontline troops, has left Moscow uneasy, highlighting the vulnerability even within Russia's borders. Despite recognizing the pitfalls of continuing the war, the Russian hierarchy remains steadfast. Such decisions are eroding the confidence of their elites and the morale of their combat troops. Even Putin's stronghold appears to be wavering. In essence, the current turn of events can be attributed to the risks undertaken by Putin. Regardless of the war's outcome, the ongoing conflicts and escalating expenses indicate that Putin has arguably compromised more than he has secured. Putin has no one left to trust the Russian army, which is in a difficult situation in the war zone because of Putin's mistakes, does not want to fight anymore. The decoupling among the generals in the Russian army has made Putin nervous. Putin, who wants to protect Moscow, ordered the S-400s he sent to war zones to be sent back. Putin has started taking precautions against a possible coup attempt. The Russian shipment train carrying the S-400s was detected by Ukrainian intelligence officials before it reached the Russian borders. The S-400s that were on their way to be shipped to Russia were blown up by the incredible operation of the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian army made such a move after this operation that Putin was completely cornered. The Russian economy, which has suffered billions of dollars in losses, is facing the biggest crisis in its history. In the last days of the war between Russia and Ukraine, the Ukrainian army had achieved a fairly large superiority. However, Putin has been left in a very difficult situation due to the internal turmoil in Russia. Putin, who was trying to suppress the rebellion in Russia, had also caused Wagner to lose power to a large extent with his crew. However, the Ukrainian army, which turned the crisis into an opportunity, began to increase its advantages even more. While Putin was dealing with the troubles in Russia, on the one hand, his desire to maintain power in the war zone and his attempt to suppress rebellions in the regions where he had dominance had a shocking effect on the world press. The Russian army has entered into a rather difficult process. However, the assistance and support to the Ukrainian army from countries around the world had caused a complete change in the balance of the war. The Russian army, which had lost control of many regions in the war zones against the Ukrainian army, had begun to withdraw, making the Russian army unable to take steps thanks to the successful operations and blocked shipments of the power given to the Ukrainian army in the war zone. After the advantageous progress of the Russian army at the beginning of the war, the successful attempts of the Russian army in the early days of the war, which had been going on for 18 months, were achieved with the support of Wagner soldiers. After the invasion of the Ukrainian territory by the Russian army, it was decided to send the Wagner army to the territory of Ukraine. Shortly after the agreement made at the meeting between Putin and Prigozhin. However, with the change of balances, there was an internal confusion. Prigozhin Wagner had attempted a coup in Russia with his soldiers. The fact that NATO member countries provided great assistance and military support to the Ukrainian army against Putin's war threats was beginning to make things increasingly difficult. Prigozhin was very annoyed that the Wagner army, which was fighting the Russian army on the territory of Ukraine, also began to suffer losses. After that, Prigozhin lashed out at the Russian government, decried with the chief of the Russian General Staff Gerasimov, and a dispute occurred between them. The decapitation of ammunition and warehouses belonging to the Wagner army by the Russian government had increased the tension between the two. Prigozhin sat on the world agenda with his stunning press statement in response to these events. Wagner leader Prigozhin made harsh statements in response to the Russian government's sanctions against the Wagner army, stating that the Russian army was not well managed on the battlefield and that basic needs could not be provided in the face of this this situation. But the soldiers could not find ammunition in any way because the military aid and ammunition sent to the region were seized by the Ukrainian army. Yevgeny Prigozhin, who led the Wagner mercenary group used as a support force for the Russian army, began to think that Putin could not properly fulfill his mission in the process. On top of this, the Russian commander's disruption of ammunition and rations shipments to Wagner's troops was the last straw for Prigozhin. Wagner, you no longer wants to suffer more losses in the constantly hot conflict and the operations of the Ukrainian army. One after another announced that he would completely withdraw his army from the combat territory in Ukraine. After these statements by Prigozhin, it caused a big controversy in the Kremlin. Defense Minister Shoigu Wagner launched an operation to retrieve the weapons and ammunition given to the soldiers again, which made Wagner leader Prigozhin very angry, and Prigozhin, you attempted a very large-scale coup in Russia last June with a Wagner mercenary army, moved to end the Putin regime. Prigozhin's coup attempt, which soon became an effective force in the country with the support of Russian soldiers in the Voronezh and Rostov regions of Russia, also supported the Wagner group, continued to grow and increase its influence day by day, while Putin, who was cornered, received support from Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko. Lukashenko, who requested a meeting with Wagner leader Prigozhin as a mediator, stopped the coup attempt by calming the parties. Prigozhin, who took refuge in Belarus after the coup attempt, continued his studies without interruption by using the facilities provided to him, having Wagner soldiers set up training centers and shooting decoys within the borders of Belarus. However, Prigozhin, who was funded by many anti-Putin politicians and oligarchs in Russia, continued to grow stronger with the support he received from the Belarusian people. Meanwhile, Putin, who took a very important step, issued a press release stating that all Wagner soldiers had been pardoned and that no soldier would be prosecuted because of Prigozhin. For the Russian army, the importance of Wagner soldiers stationed in the war zone was quite great. Putin, who made such a move in the name of maintaining his dominance in the region, wanted Wagner soldiers to continue fighting. The withdrawal of Wagner troops caused the outnumbered Russian soldiers on the combat front to lose strength day by day, and they continued to be in a difficult situation due to the pressures and operations of the Ukrainian army. But the Wagner soldiers did not respond to this call made by Putin. Soldiers who did not have the same opinion did not want to fight anymore against the Ukrainian army. The Russian government, which provided weapons and ammunition to the Wagner army sent to the war zone, had demanded the return of the supplied weapons. But Prigozhin did not deliver these munitions, which he took into the inventory of the Wagner army. The Russian government, which was on a red alert against Prigozhin's move, decided to hold an emergency meeting and hold a critical meeting. Chief of the General Staff Gerasimov and Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu were leading the meeting, which was attended by important figures of the state summit. As a result of the decisions taken after the organized meeting, it was decided to confiscate the weapons and equipment of Wagner mercenaries who left the war zone. The important headquarters of the Wagner soldiers of the Russian army who took action. Ammunition depots and training centers located in 3 different points of Russia were confiscated. Then Putin's agreement with Wagner leader Prigozhin on the permissive rights of natural resources and mining enterprises to fight in Ukraine was terminated. The most interesting thing happened while the Russian army was conducting operations on the headquarters and warehouses of Wagner soldiers. The Russian army, which carried out simultaneous raids on Wagner military headquarters, experienced a great shock when it saw that the headquarters had been completely evacuated. Wagner had taken the weapons and ammunition with him when the troops completely withdrew from Ukrainian territory. Wagner soldiers who fled to the Belarusian border with weapons and ammunition provided by the Russian government to Wagner soldiers along with war funds caused a major crisis in the Kremlin. This is the moment when all the balances happened after that. In the face of these events, Putin was completely surprised by what he would eat. Since the Russian leader no longer knows who the clue will come from, he has started to make impulsive actions and sudden decisions. However, rumors that there will be an airstrike on Moscow have caused great confusion in Russia. Putin is very worried that the generals in the Russian army made a deal with Prigozhin and attempted a coup. So there is a situation in which almost all powers in Russia have been restricted. The Ukrainian army, on the other hand, continues to conduct successful operations in the war zone, Taking advantage of this internal confrontation with Russia, the Ukrainian army has captured some towns located in Kharkiv, one of the most critical regions on the border between Russia and Ukraine. And Russian intelligence officials have taken action, with the Ukrainian army deploying a large number of long-range missile systems to the region, sharing this critical situation with Putin. The official stated that a large number of long-range missiles and air defense sites have been established in the region. It was stated that if no measures are taken, a move that will change the fate of the war in the Ukrainian army is inevitable. In order to collect intelligence and get images from the region, Sergei Narishkin ordered 3 Su-27 model Russian fighter jets to conduct reconnaissance flights in areas where the Ukrainian army is estimated to be located. However, Putin opposed this decision and canceled the flight permit. This decision made by Putin attracted everyone's attention. The reason for this decision was due to the fact that Rostov was easily captured by Wagner's soldiers during the coup. However, one of the most important airfields of Russia was located in this region. Putin, still suspicious of the existence of a coup attempt or a general who might have some connection with the Wagner soldiers, was nervous that a coup attempt would be made again if allowed. But this critical move made by the Ukrainian army still continued to be of very critical importance for Moscow. At this very moment, Putin signed a decision that will change all my balances. More air defense systems have been ordered to be deployed in Moscow. Panzer S-1 and S-300 model air defense systems have been installed in almost every headquarters and army barracks in Moscow for the successful operations and moves that Ukraine has made recently. Putin, who wants to further increase these measures, has now asked for the installation of S-400 air defense systems in Moscow. However, all of the S-400s were deployed to critical areas on Ukrainian territory and the borderline. On top of this, by Putin's order, a large number of S-400 began to be shipped to Russia from their current positions, and to S-400 air defense systems in Luhansk, where the fighting has subsided, have been activated towards Moscow. The S-400s, which were sent by train to the headquarters in the Luhansk region and to many fronts on the battlefield, were planned to be shipped to Moscow again, in the same way, in a secret operation. At this very moment, thanks to the incredible operation of the Ukrainian army, the Russian train carrying S-400s was blown up. 21 in Luhansk. The Russian Military Central Command had received orders for the S-400 shipment. The Russian soldiers who started the preparations had attracted the attention of the Ukrainian intelligence authorities, with the increased mobilization in the region after this information was shared with the Ukrainian General Staff. Ukrainian Special Forces soldiers were sent to the region for reconnaissance. As a result of the studies, Ukrainian Special Forces soldiers who saw that S-400 air defense missiles were loaded onto the shipment train immediately shared this information with Ukrainian government officials. The information sent in the war code led to the gathering of government officials and many important figures in Ukraine. Stopping the shipment to be made by this train was the most important issue on the agenda. In line with the decisions taken after the hours-long meeting, it was decided that the train would be flown by experienced Ukrainian Special Forces soldiers. It fell into the hands of the Ukrainian army. Thereupon, the Ukrainian soldiers, who immediately took action without wasting any time, began to prepare a plan to place a large number of explosives on the railway. Ukrainian Special Forces soldiers who reached the town of Sukodol, where the Russian train will pass, began to take up positions in wooded areas after placing remote-controlled plastic explosives and C4s on the railway. Word was expected from the troops with eyes to inform them that the train was coming. At this time, jammer signal deciders were installed in the region for communication that could be established between Russia and the train. Ukrainian Special Forces soldiers who were preparing trenches in response to the firing of Russian soldiers had completed all their preparations. Ukrainian Special Forces soldiers placed C4 explosives on the tracks to derail the train in a controlled way and completely blockaded the area where the explosives were found. Ukrainian observer troops gave the expected news hearing the approach of the Russian train. The Ukrainian soldiers pressed the button when the wagons containing the S-400s came upon the explosives. The train, which was derailed by a sudden explosion, began to overturn. The flames of the fire that broke out in the mechanics section of the train, where the wagon connections were separated from each other, reached a height of meters. The Russian soldiers were surprised by what literally happened. Realizing that the Ukrainian army was conducting an operation Russian soldiers began to respond by firing. After a long conflict, experienced soldiers of the Ukrainian army who completely surrounded the region began to neutralize Russian soldiers. No matter how long the Russian soldiers, you do not want to hand over the S-400s hold out. The outnumbered Ukrainian soldiers have no chance against you in this ingenious operation of the Ukrainian army. 28 Russian soldiers were taken prisoner, but the fact that the S-400 air defense systems fell into the hands of the Ukrainian army changed everything. Taking these S-400s and captive Russian soldiers with them, the Ukrainian army moved towards their headquarters in the safe zone. The Ukrainian military has decided to destroy the seized S-400 Russian air defense systems. The news that Putin's weapon, which he praised to the whole world, was burned and destroyed by the Ukrainian army, has further increased the confusion in Russia. Russian citizens took to the streets with these protests in which anti-Putin and anti-war slogans echoed in many regions of Russia. Putin faced one of the biggest crises in his history. The reactions against Putin continue to grow day by day. This situation, along with successive defeats, caused opponents of the war in Russia and opponents of Putin to react sharply. At the same time, the military losses caused the people to get excited, which led to the beginning of riots and uprisings. According to political experts, he predicts that if the process continues like this, it is only a matter of time before there is a change of power in Russia very soon. If Putin's regime comes to an end, it seems possible that the war will end as well. The sound of ambulances echoed throughout the Kremlin. Putin's condition has declined significantly. This time, however, the Ukrainian army is now taking advantage. The Russian people began to declare with great concern that you can no longer rule them when Putin is sick. Tensions on the streets of Moscow have reached their breaking point. Russian President Vladimir Putin remains the only person to have held power in Russia for nearly 30 years. Despite making many wrong decisions during this period. Putin, who is said to enjoy popular support, continued his repressive rule in many areas. But recent developments on the agenda suggest Putin's illness has resurfaced. This has become a topic of great concern for the Russian military and Putin's supporters, because Putin's illness will cause very big problems. As we all know, Putin spent his youth in the KGB, where he received very strict training. It is understood that during this period, Putin recovered from the brink of death due to serious illnesses such as pneumonia. Although Putin survived the incident, the disease never left him in the days that followed. The spots on the lungs caused him great concern. According to Kremlin sources, the disease relapses with age, and the ambulance that came to the area picked up a person and drove away. While this information had a huge impact around the world, it once again showed the world how bad Putin's health was. Putin's stance, especially in recent live broadcasts, has caused concern among war analysts and many others. It turns out that Putin is much angrier now than before and sometimes cannot pay attention to his hands and feet. This is also the reason why the live broadcast was stopped early. This raises the possibility that Putin suffers from Parkinson's disease, which is particularly common among former boxers and martial artists. The main problem is the pro-Putin establishment's attempts to cover up the incident. But despite Putin's best efforts, he is now at a huge disadvantage vis-a-vis Ukraine. The destabilizing and frustrated move will only pave the way for more support for Ukraine. As this continues and the Ukrainian army reaches the point where victory is imminent, the Russian media begins to focus on a completely different story. Putin's evil plan was exposed. Putin revealed in a propaganda video he showed to citizens that the war in Ukraine has reached a breaking point. The situation once again demonstrates the extent of the superiority of Ukrainian forces over the Russians. Despite Putin's constant attempts to destroy this portrait of a patient, the Russian people are now deeply uncomfortable with the situation. He decided to organize a very big protest against it. Attendance at Putin's rallies in Russia has dropped significantly in recent days. But another factor causing concern is Putin's recurring, mysterious stunts. According to Kremlin sources, Putin uses about 8 aliases. These are the people responsible for attending Putin's rallies and keeping secrets about Putin, who has been unable to stand up in recent days. But the real problem is recorded as the government's problem because the problem is spreading in Putin's lungs. These facts resonate with the world. Putin has reached the point where he can no longer hold rallies. There are reports that Putin was taken to an area outside the Kremlin for treatment. Here, too, Putin, who wants to lead outside the Kremlin, has screwed up. Putin's work is done by the bureaucrats around him. Presumably, Russia's political instability and many problems such as the failure in Ukraine also play a significant role because Putin is not seen as a leader who would take such enthusiastic steps toward Ukraine. We are not dealing with Putin, who has acted in a fairly calm and confident manner, avoiding steps that could get Russia into trouble. But we are dealing with a Putin who has made a lot of mistakes in recent days and succumbed to his arrogance. As events unfold, the Ukrainian army's victory over the Russians is expected to deepen, but a very big problem has arisen in Russia. Putin's bureaucrats were so shocked that they fled to where they were in Russia. Numan demonstrators began collecting signatures, arguing that the war against Ukraine is irrational and that a peaceful decision must be made in the region. In about a week, those signatures surpassed 2 million, but Putin began to act regardless of the signatures. This, in turn, will only erode trust in Putin. If this continues, the people are expected to oust Putin from power within a short period of time. Opponents of the war turned Moscow into a sea of fire. As things progress, it's a matter of time before things get more complicated. Putin has ruled Russia alone for about 30 years. Those around him are also forced to confront Putin's crimes and war crimes, while Putin is expected to face trial at regime change. Multiple international courts have also issued arrest warrants for him. These decisions led to many of Putin's bureaucrats also being brought to justice. Because of this, the teams that have the most say in how Russia is run are beginning to make breakthroughs against Russia. Because if Putin were to fall, they would also risk being brought to justice and their vast networks would be depleted. Since there is nothing Putin can do about it, the solution is to prevent Putin's collapse. But the real mistake was Putin's humiliation of Ukraine. And these crimes are starting to form the basis of Russia's fight against bigger problems. Since the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, the Russian army has lost approximately 200,000 soldiers. In addition, a large number of tanks and aircraft were lost thanks to the successful and decisive actions in Ukraine. The Russian army found itself breathless on Ukrainian soil. Putin, on the other hand, has suffered no defeat in his 30 years of rule and is therefore increasingly no longer able to feed himself on these defeats in Ukraine. If the Russian army continues like this, it will face greater losses because of the steps he has taken on certain issues. It is a matter of time before Ukraine achieves great success, especially in foreign policy, because Putin began to blame this failure on Western support for Ukraine. However, he began to issue very harsh words and threats against these countries because of these steps. Things get more and more complicated. The defeat of the Ukrainian army has reached another level because countries around the world have begun to support Ukraine and taking action against Russia. As a result of the increased quality and quantity of these support measures, the Ukrainian army has reached a completely different point. The Russian military is now beginning to change its attitude toward war because it faces a very big problem. This means that it is entirely possible for Russia to fall into a very tense situation. War analysts' comments on this topic resonated throughout the world. War analysts say the Ukrainian military is preparing to take major steps against Russia within a short period of time. The main reason is that the Ukrainian army has the quality and quantity to achieve a major victory against the Russians in a short period of time. The Ukrainian army can use reinforcements sent at short notice to carry out its most critical tasks. This operation may give Putin the most unnecessary blow. On the other hand, these coups could rearrange a lot of things to increase the income of the Ukrainian army in a short period of time, and it can be officially declared that the Russian army has now failed Russia. On the other hand, is likely to increase its losses in some areas in a very short period of time. And as these losses continue, the Ukrainian army may also be closer to the necessary victory. Step by step, the heaviest blow came from Ukraine. The Russian army is completely in dire straits. An unimaginable operation takes place aboard an ammunition train headed for Soledad, and the Russian army is facing its biggest problem so far. When Putin heard this, he went crazy with anger, and the Ukrainian army is now on the road to victory. Biggest victory over the Russians in the final days of the Russo-Ukrainian War. The Ukrainian army began to take completely different steps. Ukrainian soldiers began to achieve great victories against Russian troops, building on the previous successful operation. Ukrainian intelligence services took important steps. The Ukrainian army carried out a very large-scale operation against the train, which was considered one of Putin's last hopes. It can be said that Russia has recently faced very large internal problems and internal turmoil in the military. If coupled with the Ukrainian army's consecutive victories as the main fronts are declining thanks to the steps taken on the Bakhmut front, which Putin considers the most important, the Ukrainian army is now achieving success in many areas. Therefore, Putin decided to send a large amount of military ammunition and equipment to the Bakhmut region. The decision was announced based on information from Ukrainian intelligence services. Ukrainian troops immediately began consultations to assess the train's possible route. During these consultations, it emerged that Russia could support Bakhmut only through Zaporozhye. This information will set in motion an incredible operation in Ukraine. The Ukrainian army has mobilized its most important equipment and Ukrainian special forces to fight Russia. Ukrainian soldiers who had advanced to the point where Ukraine was most vulnerable to launching an attack in the area began to wait for signals from observation forces. This omen was recorded as one that would change the fate of the war in all regions. In addition to laying mines on the railway tracks, the Ukrainian army also deployed a large number of C-4 bombers. These remote-controlled bombs are capable of doing just about anything to cause enough damage in the area. When word came that a train from Moscow would arrive in the area, rocket launchers were installed on nearby hillsides. This will allow the Ukrainian army to ensure action as the Russian platoon approached the area. Observation units of the Ukrainian army became aware of the situation. Then he sat down and waited for the Russian train to pass. As the ammunition train approaches, the bomb's remote control is ready. As the train crossed the tracks, there was a huge explosion. The train derailed and headed toward an evacuation zone when Ukrainian troops blew up the front of the Russian train. Because the explosion was not big enough, the soldiers inside could only fight with the weapons in their hands. Ukrainian troops began firing rockets from rocket launchers at the rest of the platoon. However, it was not possible to determine exactly which vehicle Russia used to transport the explosives. Surprisingly, the Russian army began to take the lead in clashes with Russian soldiers. This is because of the heavy weapons in their hands. Meanwhile, Russian forces have informed the Kremlin of the massive ambush. But it is not the truth. Ukrainian troops hacked into the area's radios, preventing Russian platoons from contacting the center. One party in need of reinforcements is the Ukrainian army. For this reason, the Ukrainian army decided to withdraw its troops by transmitting her calculated coordinates to HIMARS, and the Russian army is one of the countries that has suffered the most serious losses. This huge success of the Ukrainian army laid the foundation for a comprehensive encirclement of the Russians, and when the rockets began to rain, the Russian troops began to flee left and right. The Russian soldiers did not expect that Ukraine would organize such an organized operation and were at a loss. Some of them surrendered with their weapons so that the bombing could not continue. There's a whole row of ammunition left. On the other hand, the Ukrainian army was unable to transport them. That is why the Ukrainian army has different plans for these trains belonging to the Russian army. After learning that Russia would send a large number of soldiers to the derailed train, they immediately placed the remaining C4s in a car packed with explosives. However, Ukrainian troops withdrawing from the area have once again made it clear that even if the Russians arrive, they will return empty-handed. The sound of the C4 rifle exploding echoed throughout the area. Although the nearby Russian military headquarters sent a large number of soldiers to the area, when they arrived, there was almost nothing in sight. The Ukrainian army began to advance towards the capital, Kiev, to celebrate this victory. But when Putin received news of the explosion, things got completely out of control. Putin's decision resonated around the world. Russian President Vladimir Putin has now begun taking different steps in many areas since the beginning of the war. The army has become unstable, completely unstable, and has lost approximately 200,000 soldiers. The situation has caused a lot of confusion, and many people in the country have expressed concern. As Ukrainian forces reverse the situation through operations in these areas, Putin wanted to put pressure on Ukraine from all sides. Although this unfair invasion attempt increased support for Ukrainian forces, it never proved Putin right. In particular, frequent embargoes against Russia have not been welcomed by the Russian people who are struggling with unemployment and many crises. But on this topic, the changes in the distribution of occupations in Russia show us data that will resonate around the world. Many Western companies have withdrawn from trading in Russia. Furthermore, Putin's government, which cannot trust investors, is now calling the deal a very big problem because the Russian ruble continues to depreciate against its currency. As a result, the Russian people are losing purchasing power every day. But the bigger problem is that people can't find jobs. Many people in Russia are unemployed, waiting for news about relatives who sent them to join the army. These people are forced to confront Putin's misguided policies every day. That is why uprisings and rebellions against Putin are constantly exposed. If this trend continues, Putin will face bigger problems sooner or later. So now that these Western companies have exited Russia, How will Putin's government respond to rising unemployment? However, these facts are shocking. Putin hired unemployed people to bury soldiers killed on the front lines. In other words, a point has been reached where a career can be regained and by becoming a cemetery caretaker or a priest. This in turn further exacerbates Russia's growing economic difficulties. The growing demand for gravediggers and priests once again demonstrates the poised strategy pursued by Putin's government. To further complicate matters, Putin has begun spending money on behalf of relatives of those killed in the war. This paves the way for Ukraine to gain more power in many areas. On the other hand, the Russian army is suffering new losses every day while pretending to show the world that it will soon face major problems. At this rate, Putin is expected to step down soon, but comments from war analysts on the ground underscore that very serious problems are only just beginning. War analysts believe that Putin is expected to achieve a greater breakthrough in a short period of time, but the Russian public is very worried about these new breakthroughs because every erratic policy by Putin paves the way for a tougher embargo on the Russian people and more support for Ukraine. If this continues, the Ukrainian army is also expected to win in a short time. The fact that the outstanding achievements of Ukrainian soldiers, especially in foreign policy, are on the agenda makes many people hopeful. And Putin didn't know what to do after this war because it completely violated Russia's foreign policy. The fighting was concentrated in these areas on the Zaporizhia front. The Ukrainian army continues to gain ground in the robotics industry, and during the last 48 hours, Ukrainian forces advanced in the vicinity of Novoprokopieva. Ukrainian sources published a series of videos showing their soldiers moving freely in the areas between Novoprokofieva and Verbov, which confirms that the Ukrainian forces now have full control over the area. The presence of Ukrainian forces in this direction can be confirmed by this footage posted today by Russian sources, where it appears that the Russian artillery targeted the forest lines located only a few hundred meters from the main line of the Russian defense. Today, the Russian source War Gonzo reported that the Ukrainian forces are getting closer to Novoprokopieva as, after artillery preparation, Ukrainian forces attacked Russian positions in the forest located only a few hundred meters north of this town. It is possible that the Ukrainian forces have already established control over the forest and are now looking to increase the pressure on the Russian defenses. East of the settlement, Gonzo also confirmed the news about an increased activity of the Ukrainian brigades on the western flank in the areas between Kapalny and Roberdina. According to some Ukrainian sources, the Ukrainian army is trying to clear the trenches between Kapalny and Robotini in order to prepare the ground for a possible offensive on Kapalny. At the moment, the advances are small, but it seems that the tide is slowly changing in favor of the Ukrainian forces because during the past 2 weeks, it was the Russian forces that tried to attack in this direction without managing to gain any ground in the direction of Verbov. The advance of the Ukrainian forces has been very slow during the past 3 days. However, based on geolocated footage, Ukrainian sources informed us that Ukrainian soldiers managed to clear another part of the main trench line west of Verbov. Yesterday, the Ukrainian EFP drones were seen hitting the Russian soldiers inside the trenches. But today this part of the trench line was hit by Russian artillery fire, confirming the advance of the Ukrainian soldiers inside the Russian defensive line. The reason why the Ukrainian forces are insisting on clearing this trench line, even though they are operating in a very dangerous environment, is that taking this part of the trench line would clear the way for a possible storming operation of the Ukrainian armored units towards Verbov on the Verbivka front. The Ukrainian army continues its efforts to advance in the Novodonetsk-Novomoskovsk sector. Based on geolocated footage, it seems that the Ukrainian forces are trying to advance and establish more control in the fields west of Novo-Donetsk with the aim of cutting the road between Novo-Donetsk and Kremenchuk, trying to put the Russian troops under the pressure of a possible encirclement in the direction of Novomoskovsk. Ukrainians continue their attempts to gain a solid foothold north of the village. It is not yet clear what the front line looks like in this direction, but judging by the geolocated footage, we can say that so far, the Ukrainian forces have suffered significant losses in this direction. On the other side of the front, it seems that the Russian counterattacks in the areas north of Paryatina were stopped. According to Ukrainian sources, Russian forces tried to establish new positions inside the forest, which is located about 2 kilometers north of Bryansk. But thanks to the work of the Ukrainian artillery and a quick counterattack, the Russian forces were pushed back on the Bakhmut front. Ukrainian sources confirmed the advance of their forces in the northern part of Grishka, and according to some of the Ukrainian sources, for the first time, Ukrainian troops entered the village of Andreyevka. which was abandoned a few days ago by the Russian troops. This video best describes the situation on the ground in this sector. The Russian forces now continue to be present only along the railway, and whenever they encounter the presence of Ukrainian troops or Ukrainian artillery, they immediately take shelter in the tunnels and dig out positions that they have built under the railway bed. The presence of these well-prepared positions is slowing down the advance of the Ukrainian forces in the northern part of the Bakhmut front. Russian forces managed to make small advances along the railway southwest of Markivka. However, some Russian sources warn that this may be a tactical maneuver of the Ukrainian forces because, according to them, the Ukrainian command maintains a high number of troops in the area, estimated to be over 35,000 soldiers, which, according to them, raises doubts over a possible counter-offensive of the Ukrainian forces in this direction.